Throughout the 1990s, it was just such a great period to be into anime, with stuff like Dragon Ball Z, Cowboy Bebop, Evangelion, and then all those films we got on VHS at the time, with Akira, Ninja Scroll, and Ghost in the Shell. The latter in particular I remember being really popular, even back at a time when not that many people even knew that kind of thing existed. Based off the Japanese manga by Masamune Shirow about a cybernetic soldier named Motoko Kusanagi in the futuristic year of 2029. Lol. A key figure in an intelligence department named Section 9, working alongside the government and dealing with cybercrime. It obviously went on to inspire a whole bunch of films and then even gaming in its wake, with stuff like The Matrix for instance drawing heavy influence from it, as well as video games like Deus Ex, Bungie's Oni, and obviously Cyberpunk 2077. There was also a TV series in 2002 and a sequel released in 2004, so yeah, fans of the series were eating pretty damn good as far as the franchise was concerned.
Aw, out of ammo?
Huh?
As well as that, we got 4 video games, most of which were released exclusively for Sony platforms, with Ghost in the Shell in 1997 for the PlayStation 1, Standalone Complex in 2004 for the PlayStation 2, and then another Standalone Complex title for the PSP in 2005. With the final game, First Assault Online, having a pretty short lifespan later down the track in 2016, but we'll get to that one soon enough. Despite there only being such a limited roster of tie-in games though, all of these I'd say are actually pretty damn good. And seeing as we got a bit of a lull in gaming at the moment, with it almost being near the end of the year and all that kind of stuff, I thought it'd be a fun old time going back and taking a look at them. So let's do that, shall we?
What's wrong?
Nothing to worry about. I'm going in.
Right, so before I get too far into things, I do have to thank Red Magic for sponsoring this video. Now, Red Magic's a brand that's been around since 2018, focusing primarily on mobile gaming with a collection of different gear including phones, accessories, and PC equipment. With a global reach of 30 countries and regions, making them one of the best gaming smartphone manufacturers in the market. And today, we're taking a look at the Red Magic 10 Pro, which delivers a massive performance boost over those previous generations, featuring liquid metal cooling, the kind of thing typically found in gaming laptops. It's got a Snapdragon 8 Elite 4.32 GHz processor, up to 24GB of DDR5X RAM, 1TB of storage, along with a 144Hz refresh rate, plus a 7000 mAh battery offering up to 25% more charge. As well as all of that, the screen is 6.85 inches with a resolution of 1.5K. What's also kind of great about it is that it just feels so comfortable when in the hand, with the entire rear panel being flat, which helps avoid camera bumping, and with a few different color choices on offer, you get the sense that a lot of effort's been put into making this thing look as sleek as possible. But I think the best thing about a phone like this is just how much of an ease of access it gives you into mobile gaming. And I'm actually kind of a little bit embarrassed to admit just how much fun I find Call of Duty Mobile. Along with, of course, all the other kinds of quality titles you can expect to find on the Play Store. Yeah, and honestly, there is so much stuff to check out on here. More than enough things to play to satisfy even the most chronic of procrastinators. So if you want to pick up the new Red Magic 10 Pro today, well, then be sure to check out the link in the video description. And yeah, thanks again to Red Magic for sponsoring this video. Now, much like a lot of other PlayStation 1 titles back in the day, my first introduction to the Ghost in the Shell game was actually its demo, which was one of the many that used to get released on those old demo discs that had come with whatever PlayStation magazine you bought at the time. 1997 was also the same year that 2 of my favourite PlayStation games came out as well, with Cool Borders 2, along with a lesser known title that no one's probably even heard of called Final Fantasy VII.
I'm just kidding.
But unlike those two, which we both had legitimate copies for, our version of Ghost in the Shell was a pirated one that my mate had given me. And I know that the term hidden gem gets thrown around quite a lot these days, mostly just by people who think that something that's old and half decent counts, but this is genuinely a really fun game that really seems to fit that moniker, where those that do know about it are probably going to tell you how much it kicked ass.
Break time's over. Let's go get him.
So the story in this one is you're obviously working for Section 9, playing as a nameless dude simply referred to as the Rookie, controlling one of those cool looking spider tanks, the Tachikomas. Sadly, not actually getting to play as Bato or Kusanagi, with them instead just serving more as support characters throughout all the missions.
So they want to liberate us, huh?
The enemy force you're going up against is one of the series' main recurring antagonist factions, the Human Liberation Front. And this time they've apparently blown up a building and killed a bunch of people, which, yeah, checks out.
Yes, 18 people were severely injured when 50 grams of C6 were detonated.
So as the rookie, the task more or less falls on you to single-handedly fight back against the HLF and try to stop them, with all roads ending at this towering building where they're trying to detonate a nuclear reactor, ending with a showdown against the leader on the top of the roof. In between most of the missions, you get these really awesome cinematics, looking like they could be taken straight out of the anime, all done with Masamune Shiro's involvement and handled by Production IG, who really worked on some pretty heavy hitters, not to mention they did those anime sequences in the first Kill Bill movies. It's the kind of thing that only the PlayStation really would have been able to pull off at the time, due to it having all that extra storage space on the disc, with there being about 10 minutes of this stuff all up. And overall, like, the whole thing feels really official, which is probably the result of Shiro being involved in the production, even writing the story and working on some of the cutscenes.
Why didn't you say so earlier?
Which means that Kusanagi looks way more in line with how she looked in the manga as opposed to the anime.
Okay, let's begin drop training, shall we?
Even that intro alone before you've gotten into the game is just really impressive, with super smooth animation and well choreographed action. And I even have this vivid memory of this movie just playing on repeat at my local game store, where I just stood there like a zombie watching it over and over. There was this really cool art book that you could buy at the time, which showed off all the individual cell frames for the animation, just kind of highlighting this insane amount of detail and talent that went into it, along with it almost being like a bit of an obituary for this more or less extinct art form. And yeah, like, remember too that all of this was done for a PlayStation game. The only bummer is how heavily compressed this stuff is by today's standards, and I'd love to see like a high resolution version of all of these sequences, because you just know that it would look fucking amazing. When it comes to the gameplay, the best way to describe it is that it's kind of like a vehicular third-person shooter, with you piloting the Tachikoma the entire time. You move around with the directional pad, along with being able to strafe left and right with the shoulder buttons. And if you hold down both shoulder buttons at once, you can also sort of sprint forward at a much faster pace. Overall, this control scheme really feels more like a first-person shooter, very similar to other titles we had on the platform at the same time, like Disruptor and Power Slave. Which is kind of funny as well, considering you've even got the option for a first-person view mode here, which becomes more or less essential during those tighter interior levels. As for the weapons, you've got a machine gun, which is pretty basic and can be spammed constantly by just mashing that button over and over. But then holding down that button is going to let you lock on multiple missiles to anything that's in range, quickly then launching them all out at once. With the catch being that if you take any damage, that whole charge up sequence for the missiles is reset, really encouraging mobility and trying to stay out of harm's way. And then finally you can fire grenades by pressing circle, which does massive damage. But these things are kind of like uranium, and you really want to save them for when you get to the boss fights. You can get like a higher end level score if you save these grenades and don't use them at all, but I don't really see the point of like worrying about a high score in a single player game, considering that you're only competing against yourself. Either way though, learning how to control this thing ain't too hard, and it won't take too long before you're climbing up walls and over buildings, seamlessly moving around these various environments and destroying all of your enemies.
Impressive, rookie.
Also helps as well that almost every single mission has some sort of drum and bass or techno soundtrack on constant loop, all of which really exemplify video game music from the 1990s. And I don't know if there was some kind of unwritten rule about this stuff or something, but I swear that every second game that came out back then had to include this kind of music by law. All up, there's like 12 missions to get through, with the difficulty ramping up with each of them as new threats and hazards are introduced.
Clear out the bombs or die.
Roger. All units, move out and find those things now.
Yes, ma'am.
with the first mission really just trying to ease you into how everything works, with the objective being to destroy these 3 spider walkers so you can gain access codes to a warehouse where the first boss is waiting. The backdrop is a clear, bright, sunny day down by the harbour, and there's plenty of power-ups around if you take too much damage, whilst the boss fight is pretty easy to take out with some blatantly telegraphed attacks that should be easy to avoid. Now this right here was the level that they used for that demo, and honestly, I reckon I played and beat this level alone than I ever spent playing the remainder of the game. The second level is where they start to ramp things up a bit, with them not wasting all that much time either, and getting that whole sewer level out of the way nice and early. And compared to the bright and sunny first mission, now you're moving through these turd-stained tunnels, avoiding explosive proximity mines, along with a boss fight that looks a hell of a lot like the Hermit boss from House of the Dead. I would say that this is easily the worst mission in the game though, and it's probably not helping either that you spend half of it in the dark with night vision mode, which just kind of looks like you're watching someone get a colonoscopy in real time. But it's the third mission though that's really likely to cause the most drama, because for this one, it's against a running clock, where you've got to destroy a bunch of explosives before the time runs out. And this one is absolutely going to take a couple of retries, just because of how some of these bombs are put in really tricky positions, and your radar doesn't exactly tell you if they're above or below.
Pass.
From here on in though, it's smooth sailing, literally. And for the fourth mission, it's like it's suddenly turned into Shinobi 3, as you're riding on like a jet ski or something, going across the ocean and fighting back against all these pursuing vehicles. I mean, it is kind of clunky with you being more or less on rails the whole time, but it's also pretty damn fun, offering up a much needed change of pace. And in fact, they more or less do the same thing for the sixth mission as well, only this time you're going down a highway like the game's just turned into Ridge Racer Type 4.
They're the same picture.
This time there's even like a couple of different routes to the level as well, offering up different hazards depending on which way you want to go. The fifth mission is a whole cat and mouse deal, where you're chasing after another cyborg that's apparently ambushed the player. And this thing hangs in one area for a bit, letting you dish out a bunch of damage before it runs away and you have to chase it down again to repeat the process. And this is like a little bit weird because the premise is that it's trying to get away from us. But then it decides that the best way to do this is just to run like 10 meters away and then just hang out in the immediate area. Yeah, it really puts the eye into AI, doesn't it? Now the seventh mission is the one that I enjoyed the most, and a lot like the first one, it drops you into this larger city environment and just lets you complete your objectives however you want, this time taking out 3 gun emplacements. And this is the stuff right here where this game is at its most enjoyable, letting you approach these mission goals however you want. Because sadly, the last 4 missions in the game aren't like this at all, and are all set in the one place, inside that big corporate building or whatever it's supposed to be for the remainder of the story.
Man, what a stupid structure to put up here.
With the whole mechanic of being able to run up the walls almost just seems kinda redundant, considering you're often just forced into moving down these narrow linear corridors where there's almost no room to even avoid attacks. Oh yeah, and it also has one of the lamest boss fight tropes of all time. That being the one where you're fighting back against like a computer mainframe or a reactor, server, or whatever the fuck it's supposed to be. And look man, it's a scientific fact that inanimate objects make the worst bosses in video games. Finished all off by that final level on the top of the building, which is the only one that I repeatedly died at, simply because I had a lot of trouble figuring out where I was even supposed to be going. I mean, the boss itself is easy enough, but even just getting there can be really disorienting, considering it's often hard to tell what's up and what's down, and whether or not I'm staring at my asshole or my elbow. Still though, it is a pretty cool little spectacle there at the end where you're both free-falling and you have to destroy this guy before he hits the ground. I'd say all up, the main problem this game has is that it's both really easy but also really short, with there only being 12 missions in total and the whole thing being able to be beaten in just over an hour. I mean, you'll probably die a few times here and there, but unless you're missing a limb or heavily intoxicated, overall it's pretty easy.
Well, stay on that and see what else you can find out.
Annoyingly too, like when you die, it makes you enter your name at the high score screen before then throwing you back to the main menu. For some reason, there's no button to just simply restart a mission. The boss fights are definitely varied visually, but when it comes to actually fighting them, for almost every instance you can easily get by just circle strafing the entire time and firing back with your missiles. And none of them have strategies that really go much further than just stay mobile and don't eat shit. Even during that 10th mission where you need to fight two at once, you still don't need to do much more than just slide around the entire time. There's also like a training mode on the side which offers up a bunch more cinematics to unlock. And apparently, if you beat the entire thing in one go without any continues, you can unlock some kind of exclusive art of the Major. Which, yeah, I guess would have been some incentive to keep playing. But I mean, like, if you were someone on the internet at that time, well, let's just say that you'd probably already seen Kusanagi getting fucked by that point.
It's true.
Overall though, a solid little PS1 action game that absolutely deserves all the recognition it deserves. And even now in 2024, damn good stuff. Up next, we got Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, released for the PlayStation 2 in 2004. Yeah, 2004, also known as the single greatest year for gaming we've ever had.
Sure, I'll keep that in mind. Because the worst is yet to come.
With this one being developed by a team called Caviar, with the only other thing these developers really worked on worth mentioning being that they made Resident Evil Dead Aim, which is arguably one of the most underappreciated Resident Evil games, as well as working on the Umbrella and Darkside Chronicles.
Now get out there and start earning your pay, people.
Anyway, this one takes place in the frighteningly close year of 2030, actually letting you play as both Kusanagi and Batou. Once again working for Section 9 and fighting back against various terrorist groups that have a real grudge against human augmentation. With the story in this one being even weirder, in that the main thing Section 9 is investigating is some kind of rice developed by Micro Machines. Yes, rice.
Rice?
Right. And then it has something to do with this terrorist faction trying to use the rice on a global scale to invoke mind control or something? I don't know, someone help me out here.
Roger that.
Yeah, honestly, like I had a bit of trouble following just what was going on. Not really helped either by how heavy-handed the dialogue is. I do know that at some point they end up in this old military complex, which is where all this mysterious rice seems to be coming from. But from that point on is where I just lost the plot. Literally.
Don't you guys have more important things to do?
I mean, if nothing else, it was very much in line with how I felt about the movies and the anime, where I spent more time just being impressed by how cool everything looks, and a lot less time about worrying just what was going on. Now, compared to the PS1 game, which used hand-drawn art during all these various cutscenes, Standalone Complex instead goes for pre-rendered CGI instead, which really doesn't hold a candle to the 2D stuff, and almost makes Kusanagi look like a completely different character. I mean, Batou still looks like himself, but the Major, she kinda looks like a real doll.
Guess I don't have a choice.
And I also think it's hilarious how she's supposed to be some kind of super high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art cyborg, designed for all these clandestine military operations, and yet somehow one of the design features was that she had to have a huge pair of knockers.
What do you mean breasts? Big breasts.
I also kind of realized about halfway through playing this that the whole idea of everyone being able to communicate by using a radio inside their heads is a pretty brilliant way of getting around having to animate all of this lip syncing.
Rice?
I will say though that for a PlayStation 2 game, this does still look pretty good, even having widescreen support as well. And as far as 2000s era PS2 games go, this one is definitely up there with the best of them. And there's just like an effortless aesthetic that they've pulled off here, really making all of these various areas and environments seem different. Weirdly too, much like the PlayStation 1 game, this one has 12 missions in total as well, and is again relatively short to beat, only taken like a couple of hours. It's a standard third-person shooter otherwise, where you move around with the left thumbstick and then aim with the right, shooting pretty much everything that moves. You're given a starting gun, but can also grab weapons from fallen enemies, like assault rifles, grenade launchers, not to mention a really awesome shotgun, which is really one of the most fun weapons in the game. especially when you found a stealth camo power-up and can just run right up to people and blast them in the face. The only real difference between playing as the Major and Bato is that Bato is much less mobile, and whereas Kusanagi gets throwing knives as a secondary weapon, Bato doesn't. Not that he's really missing out though, because those knives are kinda piss weak, and she may as well be throwing sporks at people because they seem about as effective.
These guys got some nasty toys.
Along with that, if you're playing as the Major, you've got this whole acrobatic dodge move, which really does seem like it's more for show than anything else. I mean, it does look cool and it lets you avoid damage, kind of, but you lose camera control when doing it and don't really have that much control over where you land. Aside from that, you've got the secondary attack, either throwing grenades or a melee move. With the melee, sadly really just being a simple button mashing affair, where you hit someone over and over until they finally go down. There is a nice little cinematic slow motion effect when you knock someone out, which is pretty rad, but when enemies start getting way more health points, this really becomes a far less useful mechanic. It's kind of a bummer that they didn't try to develop this system any further, considering that history has shown us that Kusanagi really knows how to throw hands during a fight. And when you compare this to the kind of melee combat we got in Oni, which really in a lot of ways was heavily inspired by Ghost in the Shell, well then Standalone Complex looks even more basic. I mean, Oni had all these various combos and moves you could use, along with multiple takedowns that were dependent on even things like the direction you were facing, as well as still integrating the shooting mechanics in a way that felt cohesive. Even that Enter the Matrix game, which came out a year prior to the Standalone Complex, despite being mostly dog shit, had a really developed melee combat system. And again too, like another franchise heavily inspired by Ghost in the Shell. When you're playing as Bato? When you're playing as Bato, you may as well be a goddamn T-800, because you really just blast your way through each of these chapters with almost complete disregard for your own personal safety. Kusanagi's chapters, on the other hand, are a little bit different, as she's able to do a few different platforming moves that he can't, mostly just wall jumping and grabbing onto ledges. Weirdly too, when you want to grab something, you have to press a button to actually do so. Compared to almost every other game ever made where your character's gonna do it automatically. And I will say as well that I found the wall jumping to be incredibly inconsistent, with there being one section in particular where you've got to scale the side of a building that honestly took me like a good 15 to 20 minutes. There just often doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it, and sometimes Kusanagi's gonna jump super high, but then other times she jumps like she's got a sprained ankle. And it just kind of seems like I'm failing the platforming because the controls are just not cooperating, as opposed to me failing because I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know, there's just like this overarching feeling of the movement and the platforming controls feeling kinda clunky, as if you're jumping and moving in small chunks at a time as opposed to it being smooth and more organic. Considering that the benchmark for platforming at the time was really set by titles like Jak and Daxter and Sly Cooper, playing something like this where your movement feels so stilted, yeah, it's definitely noticeable. I will say though that I love that animation when you drop to the ground from a bit of a height. Yeah, the old superhero landing.
Woo! Superhero landing!
And as an almost 40-year-old, the thought of even trying to replicate that movement in real life almost makes my knees cave in automatically.
Jeez, you had me worried.
What also surprised me a bit about the Standalone Complex is that it is quite a challenging game at times, and it's kind of shocking just how quickly you can be gunned down. Even though the game seems to default to easy mode for a first playthrough, you'll still get your cybernetic ass handed to you a fair bit. The good thing though is that the checkpoints in this are super generous, and you're rarely losing all that much progress when you're killed. Health pickups can be few and far between though, and there were times where I just let myself get killed when entering a new area, because not only does it give you a checkpoint there, but when you restart, it also refills your health back up. And it's often far easier doing that than just trying to play through an entirely new section with only a little bit of health left. Considering that you've still probably got like another couple of dozen bad guys to shoot your way through, which really does just make up the vast majority of the gameplay. Yeah, shooting. I mean, I do think overall that there's a lot of cool ideas in this game. Like when you take out enemy commanders, for instance, you can hack into their corps to reveal all the locations of nearby enemies, even pinging these guys through the walls. At one point, you can even hack into a sniper on a nearby tower, controlling this guy remotely and taking out all the nearby threats.
Sniping's a good job, mate.
But that's about all the creativity the combat's ever got. And it just feels like 90% of the experience is spent running around shooting the same looking dudes over and over. Occasionally, you might have to shoot up some robots, and then later in the game they introduce even badder dudes with bigger guns, but yeah, that's about it. There is one area where you actually get to control a Tachikoma, but this one's over in like 2 minutes, just as things are starting to get warmed up.
Let's go, Tachikoma.
This must be one of those bloodfests.
If nothing else, unlike the PlayStation game, this one does as well have some kind of replayability. Because after you finish the game for the first time, you unlock the option to get infinite ammo for all of the weapons, along with unlocking tougher difficulty modes. There's a local multiplayer mode with unlockables, again hidden in that single player component. Plus you can also now go back to all 12 missions to find and shoot a bunch of hidden fans, with there being 10 in each chapter, you know, if you really give a shit. So again, all up, this is far from being a bad game. And just one I think that suffered the unfortunate fate of being another title that had to come out in 2004, even launching in the US a week before Half-Life 2. Sometimes I find that when I go back and play something a couple of decades old with games like this, that the experience is often soured by how some of the mechanics have aged. But outside of the controls, often feeling like I'm trying to breakdance underwater, I'd say that time has been pretty kind to Standalone Complex.
Roger that.
I mean, I wish I understood the plot a bit more, and I do wish there was a bit more variety to the combat, but for the short time that it lasts, it's a decent looking and playing experience. And again, dare I say, something of a hidden gem.
Let's rock and roll.
Which finally brings us onto Standalone Complex for the PSP. Yeah, the 11th best-selling gaming console of all time, right behind the Game Boy Advance. And if you thought the story in the PS2 game was hard enough to follow, well, then wait until you start trying to dig your teeth into this one. But actually what stuck out to me the most here was the hilarious lip-syncing and facial animations, where it kinda looks like everyone's made out of clay and have got a trapdoor for a mouth.
That's right.
Which, yeah, to be fair, you almost have to excuse given it's on the PlayStation Portable.
Don't split hairs with me.
But even more than that, the dialogue is still really ropey, even by Ghost in the Shell standards.
That doesn't sound like something that the chief of the Public Security General Affairs section would say.
I mean, there's a lot of talk about stuff like foreign policies, cabinet ministers, and other bureaucratic jargon which just seems nauseating.
Have there been any statements or demands from the criminals?
Not at the present time. However, they seem to be looking for the H-88 report.
The H-88 report? The one that conducted an investigation of General Michiba, the mastermind of the failed Far North Rebellion 20 years ago?
Yes, sir.
It's like that scene in The Phantom Menace when Queen Amidala goes before the Senate.
Because of this, in spite of the fact that waste material, a negative legacy, has been left lying around for decades, these shams of public utilities have been forced upon us under the guise of reconstruction assistance.
Will you defer your motion to allow a commission to explore the validity of your accusations?
And I know that this kind of thing's always been a bit of a hallmark for the series.
I won't say that's not a possibility.
But I find that I enjoy Ghost in the Shell the most when it's delving into all that philosophical shit. Stuff to do with transhumanism, man versus machine, AI dilemmas and all that. No one is talking about corrupt government employees and budget cuts, where it's more like I'm watching a spreadsheet in motion.
This is what he gets for using public funds to come here and go on a sightseeing flight with his grandson.
What the hell did you just say?
Combined with all this squeaky, high-pitched dialogue from all the various Tachikomas, who kind of sound like that noise it makes when you squeeze the air out of a balloon.
Hello? Excuse me, I'm with the police. Huh?
Shut up! Shut up!
I do, however, appreciate how one of the main antagonists is a creepy little cyborg girl who carries around a humongous rifle that's bigger than she is, which is a trope that I always find hilarious. And truly, none of this stuff matters all that much anyway, on account of just how addictive it is to play through this overall. Right, so the whole thing's broken down into 6 chapters, with there being one main story mission, along with 3 other side missions to play through as well. And not only can you play through as Kusanagi and Bato, but then also Saito and my boy Togusa. With the idea being that each character has different stats and abilities. Though I noticed very early on that Bato seems to have the most health points, which meant that I ended up playing as him the most. Just swapping over to the Major when I wanted a bit of eye candy. Obviously too, this is a first-person shooter, with there being quite a lot of weapons here on offer as well, all with 3 main stats for damage, range, and rate of fire, letting you customize your loadout depending on what the mission requires, with certain missions even unlocking more guns for you to play around with. You're also being assisted in every single mission by Tachikoma.
It looks as though the bomber burned out his own cyber brain!
Able to choose from 4 different personalities, with there being intelligent, aggressive, balanced, or humorous, with those first 3 being the 3 moods my wife chooses from each morning when she wakes up. And you can even customize these things as well, covering their entire chassis in different weapons, even down to choosing what kind of paint job they've got on the surface. Sadly though, there's no option to shove a sock in that stupid voice hole.
What's up?
Having one around constantly as well also means they take a bit of the brunt away from enemy attacks. And in fact, early on, these things are so effective to the point that it's almost worth telling them to not shoot, considering they're going to often kill everything before you've even had a chance. Later in the game though, when the missions become much tougher, you're going to really rely on this quite a bit. And the right loadout even starts to become essential, along with hopping into one of them to assume control becoming a handy way of mitigating the damage your character takes. If either of them die during a mission though, it's a game over. And let me tell you man, this shit becomes super unforgiving towards the end. Thankfully though, none of these missions are too long, and most of them can be beaten anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, which is really the perfect format for a handheld console. The kind of thing you just want to play on the go, or when you've been turtling a fat shit for the last hour and really need to jump on the throne and do your business.
People are fragile creatures.
It does start to get a bit repetitive towards the end, I will admit, with there being at least 3 missions there where all you have to do is destroy a bunch of enemy vehicles as quickly as possible. And it seems how easy or hard these missions are just depends on whether or not you've unlocked enough missile launchers for your Tachikoma. They also do the most unforgivable thing though, which is where they have not 1, but 2 fucking escort missions. The first of which where you've got to escort your boss, Aramaki, through the train station. And I've seen senior citizens who suffer from crippling arthritis move faster than this guy does. Along with the second one where you're escorting a bunch of repairmen through some back alleys, where guys with missile launchers are going to pop out of nowhere to suddenly ambush you. Still though, it really surprised me just how much fun this thing was to play through, considering that I'd never even played it before this video and went in there with 0 expectations. And I think that constant reward of getting new toys to play with, along with trying to find all those hidden little robots to destroy for bonus gear, is more than enough to hook you in. Most people would agree as well that playing a first-person shooter on the PSP is super clunky, given how the controls for aiming up, down, left and right are all bound to the face buttons. But it seems they found a way to even work around this, by including a really handy lock-on system when firing at enemies.
Perfection.
The only thing that genuinely brings my blood to a boil is that it seems the only way they figured they could increase the difficulty is just to include tougher enemies late game. Along with including those who carry around missile launchers. And I don't know what it was with mid-2000s games, but seems like almost every single one of these 6th generation games tried to pull the same shit. Either way, this was the last Ghost in the Shell game we got until 2016, when there was one final last hurrah with Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex First Assault Online. Yeah, say that 5 times fast. Now this was a free-to-play, multiplayer first-person shooter with a whole ass load of customization options when it came to all the different characters, skills, and abilities. Dropped on Steam in early access in 2015 and then entered an open beta in 2016. And I do remember vaguely picking this one up and playing it a little bit before kinda giving up and then never touching it again. Which is a sentiment I guess a lot of other people also shared, considering it never really seemed to take off all that much, reaching only around 4.6k players on Steam at its absolute peak. And it probably didn't help either that Overwatch came out around that same time. And then in 2017, they shut this thing down for good, with it at least being able to say that it lasted longer than Concord did. I've actually been trying to get this thing working on and off for years now, and in fact there's a somewhat active Discord community still dedicated to playing it. But despite me troubleshooting it repeatedly, it's something I've still never been able to get working. So yeah, like hopefully if you want to check it out, you're going to have more luck than I did. I don't know if the game's failure really hurt the publishers Nexon, considering those guys more or less seem to be able to print money. But it sure did seem to mark the end for Ghost in the Shell related video games. And it's really one of those franchises I'd love to see some kind of a reboot or an update for. Obviously it's not quite as futuristic anymore, given that the game's timeline is barely half a decade away from where we are now. But it's still widely regarded as one of the most important anime series of all time, and Kusanagi's popularity still clearly lives on. For me, like simply watching that first movie helped to spark a lifelong fascination with the genre, along with seeing Chun-Li's tits in the Street Fighter 2 anime, and the stone demon dude catching a giant blade with his face in Ninja Scroll. And I guess with titles like Cyberpunk 2077, that's more or less carrying the torch as far as the genre is concerned anyway.
So how the fuck do you know so much?
Still though, if nothing else, I hope I've done a decent job at bringing to light a few of these lesser known titles, and just another few games that we desperately need a re-release for.